Wrangler only has enough room for 2 people comfortably. The back seat is not that spacious. But that's still my car. Get rid of this as soon as the campaign's over. Let's go back to driving the Jeep.
We're about to get started, okay? Thanks.
Our newsrooms go all the way up to Delco, Delaware County.
Okay.
Montgomery County.
Okay.
All the weeklies out there. Lansdale.
Oh, okay.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started then. Thank you for coming and visiting us, Mr. Wolf. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Great. And so my name is Scott Fisher. I'm editorial page editor for the Daily Record, and we have editors from other digital first media properties here with us. We have Stan Husky from Norristown. We have Andrea from Lebanon.
Lebanon.
And we have Katie from Hanover here. And we also have some editors from, I'm not sure who's on the line right now, but some folks on our conference line here as well. So they'll be listening in and possibly chiming in. And we want to thank everybody who took the time, our readers who took the time to come out and participate with us today. So hopefully we'll have some time for you to ask some questions at the end. And I also wanted to mention that if you want to comment on this session live as it goes on, and you're on Twitter and you have your mobile phone with you, you can use the hashtag WolfYDR. So go ahead and comment on that, and that will be pulled into our live coverage of this session.
Okay.
So if you don't like my questions, you can say that. All right. So let's get started. So as one of your hometown newspapers, some people have suggested we've been a little too friendly and kind to you as a newspaper. So I want to start off with a real hardball question, if that's okay.
Could I just counter? I don't think you have.
Okay, good. So I'm going to start off with a real hardball question.
Okay.
If elected governor, would you commute to Harrisburg or would you live in Mount Wolf?
That is a hardball question. I commuted when I was Secretary of Revenue, and it was a really easy commute. So I want to be at home as much as possible, but I'm told that I should spend time, as much time as I can in Harrisburg, and I'm certainly going to use the residence, if I'm elected, would use the residence for official functions.
Okay. So now Mount Wolf would be sort of the secondary capital or the secondary as governors.
It's always the primary capital.
All right.
My heart.
All right, so on to some more serious questions. As a community leader and businessman, you've had kind of a reputation as an innovative thinker and doer, but your campaign has offered sort of, at least from our perspectives, some fairly predictable democratic positions. And I'm just wondering if you could give us an example of some maybe third-way thinking, or maybe some out-of-the-box thinking, something that we might not expect from a Democratic candidate.
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think I've been out of the box. I'm an unusual candidate to start with. I'm certainly an unusual Democrat. And I think this campaign really showcases that. I am a product of the market. I am a fan of the market. I've built a business twice in the market, and I think I know as much or more about what the free market entails and requires as anybody. And my understanding and my insights are that the market requires a constructive partner in government. Government should not do everything, but the government can't do nothing. And so, as a double negative, but I meant that to be a double negative. So there are certain things that government should do to make the market work optimally. And I've talked about 4 things. The market is incapable of dealing with externalities. The market is incapable, as Adam Smith said, providing public goods. No one in the market has the incentive to do that. The market can't deal with collective action problems. So you have a strong role for government. There are 4 things that I think government should do in a limited government market economy. Whether you call this the third way or the Republican way or the Democratic way, I think it's the reasonable and practical way. Government should do a few things really well. One, it should make sure it does a good job providing education. Education is a public good that we need to have a strong economy. We need to have strong families. If we're going to have strong communities, we have to invest in it. I understand you can't throw money at any problem and get a good outcome, but you cannot disinvest in it. You've got to make sure that education is working optimally. Second, government should do investments in public goods that are strategic, not episodic. So Pennsylvania is a keystone state. Transportation is something that Pennsylvania really ought to take advantage of in terms of connecting the three ports, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Erie. We can do some things if we make that strategic investment using public-private partnership dollars, but looking at things that are going to produce a return. If government is actually doing its job of setting the table for private sector growth, it's got to invest in things strategically that are going to actually multiply private sector robustness. Third, we are blessed with natural resources here in Pennsylvania. So uniquely, Pennsylvania's government should again, work with market forces to make sure we're exploiting those and taking full advantage and responsible advantage. And this is where externalities come in, as well as public goods, taking full and responsible advantage of those natural resources. Gas is top of mind right now. I want to put a 5% severance tax on that. But, you know, we have timber here. This is one of the richest sources of hardwoods in the world. We have fresh water here. We have open space, agricultural land. We have coal. We have a natural location. I mean, we have natural resources here that we ought to take advantage of, and the government can be a partner in, you know, moving the market in a way that is responsible in terms of taking advantage of those. And then finally, the market is not a naturally occurring thing. It is a jumble of conventions, habits and patterns and regulations. And government needs to make sure that that market is working optimally from its rules, a level playing field, that it's inclusive, that the market is actually offering what it offers for everybody. I keep using the example of my two daughters. One's an architect, one's a geologist, one lives in Brooklyn, one lives in San Francisco. They don't look at Pennsylvania as a place where there's a level playing field. In Pennsylvania, they think, you know, it's who you know, who you gave a yacht trip to, where you live. And so top of mind for them and many young people is San Francisco, New York, Boston, Austin, Seattle, not Pennsylvania. I think part of the reason Pennsylvania is not top of mind is because we look like a place that doesn't have a level playing field, that if somebody wants to come here and take risks, they may not get the return on that risk that they deserve. So those are four things. Now, I don't know whether you call that a third way. I don't know whether you call that traditional democratic thinking or even more conservative thinking, but a government that sets the table for robust private sector growth really has to pay tribute to some of the things that I think Democrats have traditionally paid tribute to: fairness, inclusion, and we have to have a system of government that we can trust. And I think those things may make me look like a traditional Democrat, but I come to those values from a very private sector perspective.
Thank you. So one of the sort of persistent issues in this campaign has been your tax reform plan. Some people have complained that it's too vague or nebulous. And last week, Governor Corbett stopped by to talk to us, and his folks left this, and he said that these are all the grains that you need to figure out how people would be taxed under the. And I just wonder, we have a whiteboard up there. Would you like to try to sort of explain it to us?
Well, let me come on. That's very funny. let me just point out, if you can see this. This is 2012. Now, when the governor did the 2014-2015 budget, they actually had information from 2013. You're asking me to do a 2015-2016 budget with 2012 information. This is already on the internet. I've already seen this. It's on the website of the Revenue Department. Now, keep in mind, I was the Secretary of Revenue. I know what information you need to make really good, well, reasonable projections. And by the way, using all that information that they had at the Revenue Department, they were still $700 million off last year. So you're asking me to take outdated information that actually is not in the form that the Revenue Department uses to make its own projections, because it's bundled, not individual. And by the way, you don't want me to have your individual information. That's confidential. It should be, and it is in the Revenue Department. I never saw it as secretary, but our people who analyzed it and came up with projections used it. That's what it takes to come up with actual tax rates. There's one other thing. I don't know how deep the hole is that this governor is going to leave, whoever the next governor is. There is a big fiscal problem brewing. I think there's a reason why three rating agencies have downgraded the bonds of Pennsylvania 5 times over the last 2 years. things aren't going real well, and whoever is in charge of coming up with a budget for next year, including a tax plan, is going to have to understand how deep that hole is. Let me say, I have been really specific on my tax plans. I want to make a fair tax system for Pennsylvania. I want to reduce the reliance on property taxes in terms of funding of public education. I want to reduce the corporate net income tax, which is shamefully, disgracefully, the highest in the United States, the highest average rate, 9.99%. And I want to make the personal income tax system fair. And you can do that within the uniformity clause of the Constitution, I think, with the way I'm doing it, because it's the way I'm proposing is exactly what we're doing right now. We have an exemption. It's complicated, and it's called the special poverty provision, but we do it, and then we have one flat rate. That's what I'm talking about, a different calculation for the exemption, but the same rate. I've also been explicit and specific in terms of who would benefit. I want to give the middle class the first tax cut on the personal income tax they've had in over 20 years. And I'm looking at the middle class. I've defined that, $70 million to $90 million. Now, I have that range. Yeah. That range depends on where you live. I'm sorry. Did I just say that? I meant 70,000. Yeah, 70,000 to 90,000. And that would be, a married couple. Joint filers would be 140 to 180,000. Thank you for the correction, Scott. So I've been specific to saying that if you're making below that, you're going to get a tax cut. I want to have a tax cut. So yes, I'm proposing a fairer tax system. I've been explicit in terms of 5% severance tax. I've been explicit in terms of dropping the property tax by bringing the state share of funding for public education up to a 50% as fast as I can do that. By reducing the corporate income tax. I proposed that, by the way, as a member of the Business Tax Reform Commission that's met over 10 years ago, and I've been talking about that ever since. And I'm specific about wanting to create a more progressive state personal income tax. I can't use information like this and come up with a specific rate without lying to you. And I think you don't want me to be dishonest. And I also can't predict how cold this winter is going to be. And I refuse to do that. So I'm not going to be specific about that.
Okay.
So on the progressive income tax, how much do you want that to be? How much new revenue do you want that to bring in? Do you want that? I mean, not because I know there's going to be the reduction in the property taxes, but is it going to be revenue neutral? Like,
yeah, I'd look at it at not bringing in new revenue. I'm looking at the new revenue for the property tax as really largely on the backs of increased economic activity. In the Rendell administration, they got the state share of funding up into the 40% range. And that was, remember, during his administration, there was a terrible global recession. And I think over time, with appropriate economic growth, we can get to 50% and make sure that results in reductions in property taxes for property taxpayers.
would it be like a direct, I mean, would it be a direct link in terms of?
You'd have to have some direct link, yes. You'd have to make sure, because what I want to...
Millage rate, like, I'm talking like a millage.
Right. You want to make sure that what doesn't happen is that this new money that comes in because of increased economic growth ends up just in increase in not all else being equal, just increases in budgets for local school districts. You want to make sure this is targeted to decrease the property tax burden.
When you say decrease the property tax burden, would you support something like House Bill, Senate Bill 76 that would eliminate the property tax?
No.
Why?
I think there ought to be local skin in the game. And so instead of going directly to trying to eliminate it, well, there's another reason too. I don't think the numbers actually work on Act 76. But even if they did, I think there ought to be local skin in the game. I think local residents ought to have the ability to support and the control over their support for public education in their localities. I just want to make it more of a balance. Right now, state funding on average is in the 30% range. I want to bring it up to the 50% range and have the local share go down in proportion to that.
There's another sort of persistent...
Is there any if I take a drink
Absolutely,
of water?
it's there for you.
Okay, thanks.
But, sure.
How does healthcare figure into your plans for the state if you, in the governor's seat? Specifically, would you take the Medicaid expansion reimbursement money and what would you do with the proposed healthy PA plan?
That's a good question. My understanding of the waivers that the federal government has given to the state for the healthy PA is that you can actually just, the next governor can simply, if in this case he chooses, can simply expand Medicaid without any interruption of service. And I would do that if I am elected governor. And I'd also set up a statewide exchange. And I think that would do a couple things. First of all, it would reduce the cost of the access to health care that is now embedded in Healthy PA. Even with all the waivers, it's still slightly more expensive than just simply expanding Medicaid. If we set up the statewide exchange, we get to control the sign-ups for the expanded access. And there's still some concerns under Healthy PA that some of the insurers, providers are actually not interested in participating, which is an unsolved, as I understand it, problem. So my solution would be to simply expand Medicaid and to set up the statewide exchange. Can I just add one thing to that? I want to add, this maybe gets back to the perspective that's different for me in terms of access to health care. We often look at health care and access to health care as something that I think is a social welfare issue, and it is. It's the right thing, I think, to do from a moral point of view to give people in the United States access to health care. This is something other developed nations around the world have done. But it's also practically a smart thing to do from an economic development point of view. Let me give you a story that I was walking through one of my facilities not too long ago, and someone came screeching up to me in a forklift, jumped off, stuck his finger in my chest and said, "I hate our health insurance program." So first thing I was thinking was, where's the respect? I mean, you know. But the second thing was, we have a great health insurance program. You know, it's really, you know, traditional indemnity program. You can go anywhere you want, covers your family, low deductible, low copay. What's the problem? And so he said, no, I like the health insurance program. He said, my problem is this. I'm 49 years old. I don't want to hump boxes in your warehouse for the rest of my career. So I said, well, you don't have to. We have actually career tracks. We have training programs. You can take those things and you can move into something else that you know you might like better. He said, nah. He said, I don't like the industry. And I said, well, that's a problem because nothing I can do about that. Just for my edification, what do you want to do? He said, I'd like to be a furniture maker. So I said, well, why don't you do that? He said, because I can't get health insurance. And so I said, yeah, you know. So he went away and we laughed and stuff like that. But I was talking to a friend of mine that evening. I said, told him about the story, which I thought was kind of amusing. He said, that's called job lock. And he said, millions of Americans, this is Drew Altman, who's Kaiser Foundation. He said, there are millions of Americans who are victims of job lock. And he said, the problem with it is whether it's a pre-existing condition or just the uncertainty of whether this person might be without health insurance for 3 years and have a family emergency and then be uncovered, this keeps that person from going off and maybe starting a company that would maybe create good furniture for all of us and maybe create good jobs. And so I'm not saying that all those millions of people would go off and create good jobs. I'm not saying they're all entrepreneurs, but some of them would. And so if we didn't have that problem of job lock, our economy would probably work better. And so, again, this gets back to Scott's question. It's not just a matter of social welfare. It's not just sort of a democratic thing that you do because, you know, it seems like the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do. But it's also really smart. If we had, I mean, the countries that have universal access to health care and don't have job lock problems actually have healthier, all else being equal, healthier economies.
Let's ask some more education questions. I know it's a big issue for you. And I'd like to stay a little bit focused on York for just a second.
Mm-hmm.
So York City School District is undergoing a recovery process. And I'm just wondering, I know you've said that you don't like the idea of charterization.
Right.
I think that's a good idea. But what can we do to fix the city school district? We've argued in editorials recently that we think the real issue is concentration of poverty. And that's a problem in lots of small cities in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
What can we do to break that?
Well, I was on the Urban Commission on Urban Schools in the 90s, and we were talking about this back then. We're still talking about it. And somebody stood up in one of the hearings in Philadelphia, I believe, and said, you know, seems to me, I'm not real educated, but it seems to me if you want to fix urban schools or neighborhood schools, maybe you ought to start by fixing the neighborhoods. And when you point out that we have a problem of concentration of poverty, we have some root cause issues that lead to great disparities between school districts. My daughters went to the Northeastern School District, which is actually, I think, the second poorest school district in York County, or was when I was there, or my daughters were there. And it's the way we fund public education that puts school districts like Northeastern and the city of York, the city of Philadelphia, and Warfordsburg, Pennsylvania, into situations where they have to make bad choices. And so my opposition to the charterization, and they're really, really good people who are working on that. And I don't mean to denigrate the work that they are doing to try to fix our schools, but they've been given a bad set of options. And so my criticism is that we ought to look, if concentration of poverty, as you point out, is one of the issues, and I agree, it is. If the racial segregation of our schools in places like York is a root cause of the problem, we ought to be dealing with that.
Should we desegregate? Would you go down that road? Busing?
No, that hasn't worked. So you know, you're asking me in a few minutes to come up with the magical cure for something that has plagued American schools, but certainly Pennsylvania schools for the last 2 or 3 decades. And I can't do that. I was president of Better York for 12 years, and we worked with you guys in terms of the Rusk Report and other things, trying to come up with looking at root cause issues for this concentration of poverty in places like York and places like Mount Wolf, boroughs that have been built out, the racial segregation of our population in York County. I spent 12 years looking at that as president of Better York. It's a real priority, and I have not been any more successful than you have in coming up with a specific set of recommendations. So I don't know what exactly.
We basically suggested maybe the suburban school districts should take over management of parts of
Yeah,
the city.
and I know that, and that's.
Why not merge with York Suburban or recombine with York Suburban?
It's an interesting proposal. That still leaves the unsolved, the root cause issue that you have a city of York that is hollowed out, and city of York is facing, which I'm sure you'll ask about, other problems that are rooted in the concentrations of poverty. We need to address those issues, and I think we need to be careful. And this is maybe not a politically expedient thing to say, but I think we need to be careful about resorting to futile gestures. That, you know, it's decisive. You're taking action. By gum, that's a good thing. Well, you know, it's decisive, yes. It's an action plan, yes, but it doesn't really, in my mind, address the root cause issue here. And I think, as I say, I agree with you. Charterization does not deal with the leaves undone and unaddressed the problem of concentration of poverty.
Just staying for a second on that, would you, if you were elected, would you try to stop that process? Like, would you remove David Meckley as the...
David and I have talked about this, and I've talked to him a number of times and asked him, you know, about this. And it's just something, you know, he's a really good person. We just disagree on this, and we agree to disagree on this. And I don't know. That would be a tough call for me. He's a good person. He's trying to do the right thing. Again, as I told him, I lament that he is dealing with the limited set of options he's dealing with because, you know, he feels an intelligent, good human being, that this is the best of the options that he has.
Okay. Let's move on to higher education. So you've said you'd like to reverse Governor Corbett's higher education cuts. I'd like to know exactly, what do you mean by that? Like, how much would you reverse or turn the tide on that?
Well,
specifics on that?
yeah, I'd like to go back to the level, get back over time, as we can afford to get back over time to the level of funding when he first came in to office. But I'd like to do it differently. I think when it comes to higher education, and don't forget I spent a lot of time in higher education, so it's something I know something about. We have an access problem and an affordability problem. When I was chairman of the board of York College of Pennsylvania, we prided ourselves on being a private college that actually remained affordable. Our tuition rate is actually lower than York College's tuition rate when I was there was actually lower than Penn State. As a private college, with all the virtues of private education, small class sizes, but still the low tuition rate. We need to address the issue of access and affordability, and public support is one thing. I think leadership is another. There are some interesting examples in the private sector and the public sector of colleges doing a good job of trying to remain accessible and affordable. Again, your college is an example. Across the river, Franklin and Marshall, the new president there, Dan Porterfield, has actually gained some national attention by trying to make Tony, Franklin, and Marshall actually more accessible and more affordable. He's made some good progress. I think we can learn from that, but I think a governor can use the bully pulpit of governor to stand up and say, this is really important. We need to make college, higher education accessible, and there are ways that we can do that, including the state shouldering, I think, a share of the burden for public education. By the way, the state shoulders a share of funding for private schools, too. There's a head tax that goes to places like even your college in support of Pennsylvania students who go to colleges here in Pennsylvania. Second thing I think we need to do in higher education is make sure that the skills that we're providing are relevant to the needs of a 21st century economy. And I think we can encourage things like the growth of STEM education, both at the primary and secondary and at the higher education level. And then finally, in my manufacturing plan, my 47-page précis of what I'd like to do, I talk about trying to take a better advantage of the intellectual capital that exists in institutions of higher education throughout Pennsylvania and try to connect them more with the workplace. I was at MIT, where I did my PhD. MIT, when I was there, I think still does, has an office whose sole responsibility is to try to monetize the basic research that goes on in the laboratories. And an example of that is some astrophysicist, I think some time ago, developed a way of identifying dark matter in the universe. Well, that's basic research. What does that have to do with anything? Well, this organization realized that actually that might be helpful for Homeland Security, is trying to figure out what's in those containers coming into our ports without opening all of them up. What it took to identify dark matter in the universe might help us identify whether you have oranges, bananas, or something else in those containers without opening them up. And it led to a patent and some new technology and some new jobs as a result of that. I think we can do a better job of that. I think one of the ways of putting money into higher education is not just the amount, but how you do it. Maybe we should create an incentive for monetization of basic research at a place like Penn State and say your funding will have something to do with how many patents come out or how much private equity you can raise or private capital you can raise in support of ideas coming out of your laboratories. Things like that. So it's not just a matter of throwing money at something, but it's a matter of saying, can we do this in a more innovative way, in a more creative way to spur the kind of research and practical benefits that could come from all these great institutions of higher education we have here in Pennsylvania.
I'll get you just one
While
moment.
we're on education.
Go ahead.
Can you address the state pension crisis and how you would try to handle it? And does your fiscal plan call for taxing pensions?
My plan does not. The 1099R income is not taxed in Pennsylvania. And I haven't made any proposals to change that. In the pension issue, and again, there's a semantic issue as to whether it's a crisis or a problem. I don't care what your crisis problem. We're not where Illinois is, but we will be if we don't deal with it. And there are two aspects to this. We talk about plan design, and that's where the flurry of activity seems to be and different ideas. Personally, I have consistently said that I think the plan design changes made 4 years ago in Act 120, which is a bipartisan effort on the part of the Commonwealth to come up with a new pension plan that was cheaper, a reduced benefit for employees. It was agreed to by the representatives of the employees, but we ought to give that a chance to work. And it's pretty draconian stuff. I mean, they had revenue. It's a sharing of return, a risk. If it goes below 5.5%, the employee shares in that. It's a 10-year vesting. I don't know what your vesting is here, but I think in the private sector, we're either 5 cliff or 7 phase-in. So somehow they've gone to a 10% vesting, going from a 2.5 to 2 multiplier. Employees, this is a contributory defined benefit plan, so that employees up until Act 120 were allowed to take out up to 30% in terms of a lump sum payout on the time of retirement. They gave up that right. So it seems to me that the employees have already given in on some pretty draconian measures. I think I'd blush if I went to my employees and asked for that kind of pension reduction. So I'd like to give that a chance to work. The other thing, though, that no one seems to want to talk about is the underpayment. The underpayment that the Commonwealth, the employer, has been making over the last 10 plus years to that benefit plan. Now, if you talk to governors, they say, we made all the contributions we should have made, which is technically true. But it's true only because the actuarial assumptions that went into those calculations were inflated. In the private sector, at the end of the year, if you have a defined benefit plan, you sit down with your accountants and then the actuary, and you haggle with them. But they say basically, you got to have your assumptions based on what's your return going to be of your investments. It has to be sort of what's going on in the market. It can't be something that you jack up just for the sake of jacking it up. The accounts will also say, in the private sector, you have to have your interest rate in terms of what you assume realistic. You can't jack it up. Well, in the state, they don't have to do that. They can actually have inflated interest rate assumptions. In fact, they fix an interest rate assumption on their defined benefit plan. And they legislated back, I think in 2000, an inflated return on investment, so that when the market tanked and investment returns were negative, Pennsylvania was blithely going along assuming that we have an 8.5% or 7.5% return on investment. So when the actuaries came in, they'd sit down with these inflated assumptions and say, here's my calculation. Oh, you don't owe much. Just pay this little bit. And so the state was doing it legally. The problem was, and the New York Times had an article on this about a week ago, in terms of the Dutch looking at public sector pensions the same way we look at private sector pensions, and that is, you've got to do it at market. You've got to take into account realistic market assumptions. And when you do that, if the market tanks, you owe more, but it's sort of pay as you go, and you got to contribute. We didn't do that. So right now we have a problem.
Try to bring that into some tangible terms here, see if I'm understanding that correctly. A way to address the pension problem is to have the state pay a more realistic share of it, which would result in the state needing to pay more into pension fund, which would require a way to fund that increase in it.
Right.
It's not a matter of semantics when you look at it that way. It's to simplify it. I don't mean to oversimplify it, but to simplify it, the state needs to pay more money into the pension fund in order to help fix the problem with the pension fund.
It needs to pay what it didn't pay. We have a back payment. It's
A little bit deeper. Some school districts weren't paying their at all for the return from the market. You want to stick. You're not looking at moving.
Now, back to Randy's question embedded there, how do we do that? Go to the public and say, okay, we have a 47 liability, and that is the present value of, mathematically, of a 20, 30, 40-year payout that's going to be made. So we don't know that right now, but the present value of that is $47 billion that we have to pay over the next 30 or 40 years. But part of that, embedded in that, is about $9 or $10 billion that is the result of our not having paid into the plan adequately. And so the question is, how do we come up with that? I've suggested a pension obligation bond. I think Glenn Grell, some others, conservatives, have suggested that, but some others have said, well, there's some problems with that. I'm willing to look at if there's a better way to come up with that. I think the pension obligation bond, at least for a private sector company, allows you to amortize the repayment of that over a much longer period of time, that debt, than you would if you did it in 1 year or 2 years or 3 years or a short time to try to just make up for this in one fell swoop. If there are other ideas, I'm open to that. What I'm not open to is delaying payment anymore, because that delay of payment, just like in, if the collection agency calls and you say, I'm not going to answer the phone, I'm just going to put off paying for another week, the balance goes up. and the service charges go up. It compounds itself. So we have to address this issue. We have to do it in a way that is affordable, but we all have to recognize that part of the problem with the pension plan is that we haven't been paying into it for the last 10 plus years.
Well, you can also say the problem is it's a defined benefit, and that the shareholders, for lack of a better term, are not subjected to the vagaries of not subjected to the market. So we, the taxpayers, continue to pay the people retiring at a defined rate no matter what, and it's not a system that's working very well in the private sector either. Most private sector employers have gotten away completely from defined benefit.
We actually have a mix in my company. We did that to actually improve the benefit for employees. We're paying more now than we were in the defined benefit plan. But I think what employers are seeing now, there's some concern. It's early, but there has been a big shift in the private sector to defined contribution plans. But as employees are retiring now, they're looking at what they've saved under the defined contribution plan and saying, this isn't what I bargained for. I don't have enough money here. And some of them are actually going back to the employer and saying, you're partially to blame for this. You didn't direct me in the right, you didn't give me the right set of options. Now, so far, the courts have ruled in favor of the employers. But there's a concern among private sector employers who have pension plans, defined contribution plans, that the objective of that plan is retirement security, not the ownership society, not giving you control, not reducing the expense for the company. And to the extent the courts pull in that direction, you're going to start to see defined contribution plans act a lot more like defined benefit plans. So I am for keeping a defined benefit plan in the state, because I think in the private sector, we're at an unusual point in time. Back when we were an unusual point in time with managed care in the early 90s, that's pretty much shifted back to more traditional looking insurance plans. We call them different things, but I think the same thing's going to happen in the pension thing. There's one other thing I think we've got to keep in mind. When I was revenue secretary, I would have problems competing with the private sector to attract good people to the Department of Revenue. And part of the reason was the base compensation was typically well below what somebody could get in the private sector. So I would say, well, just wait a minute. The compensation package includes health care, health insurance, and pension. And if you look at those things together, I'd get a little more competitive. It wasn't a slam dunk. It wasn't something that would fall right into place. I'd usually still lose them. But at least I could say, if you look at all these things together, we're not that bad, and we have some security. So the security aspect of it, the defined benefit aspect of it, was something that was attractive. To the extent we reduce that, and admittedly, if you just isolate the pension benefit, it's a really good one. But to the extent we reduce that, it's not just a matter of what we're doing with the pension issue. It's what we do to the overall compensation plan, and we're going to reduce our ability, yet again, to attract good people to the public sector. So that security is something that I think attracts people to the public sector. It helps us make the public sector somewhat competitive with the private sector, where there's less certainty. And that's another reason for my thinking that in the public sector, the defined benefit, regardless of the other things that are happening to the defined contribution plans. In the private sector, I think the public sector, we ought to stick with the defined benefit plan.
And just one thing with pension costs, full employee pension costs, I think it's 2010-11 was about $288 million. It's over $1 billion now. That's for the state share. When we talk about I think you mentioned there as $1 billion education cut, that doesn't factor in pension costs. And if pensions help retain and attract employees, why isn't that considered classroom spending, or why isn't that considered part of the total compensation package?
I'm sorry.
If pensions help attract and retain employees,
yeah,
why not count that when you in your ad said Governor Corbett cut $1 billion from education? That doesn't factor in pension costs. Why not factor in pension costs if they are important?
No, I'm fine with factoring pension costs. The first year he cut $1 billion from education, and that happened, he said, because the money dried up from the stimulus program. But I don't think he disagrees that he cut $1 billion, or $1 billion was cut from education in that first year.
I mean, that same year he increased pensions from $288 million to $600 million, and they've increased since then. I mean,
so what was, in your calculation, what was the drop in education funding?
It my calculation.
Yeah.
Let me look at my charts, but.
No, just from your math there, it sounds like it was somewhere around $700 million.
Well, we lost
No, but-
$866 million from the stimulus dollars.
Right,
No, but
okay, but wait a minute,
I'm
let
just
me,
not sure on pensions, because pensions have increased so much that we're now spending
Right,
more. The
right.
state is spending more, no matter how, like, unless you don't count pensions.
right.
And so in the last debate, you talked about 580 million not being restored.
To the classroom.
But why not count pensions towards classroom if they help attract, if they're part of the compensation package? That's what I mean.
Yeah, here's my thought on this. In the year before he took office, the budget had $6.4 billion in money that was going directly to three areas: basic education, the accountability block grants, and charter school reimbursement. Those areas are still down by $580 million. Now, changes in the pension calculations have come, and some of that is going to education, some of that's going to the public sector, non-education expenses. But his first year, he cut $1 billion from education. Now, it did come from the fact, as he says, that the stimulus was cut that year too. That was the year that the stimulus, which he opposed, by the way, was cut. I don't know.
Well, how do you call that a cut then? If we're
Well-
not handed $1 billion, how are we supposed to hand that $1 billion back out?
Yes, okay. Here's how I do it. Now, again, if we want to get into an argument about priorities, by the way, there were other programs that were where the stimulus program money was cut: corrections, Department of Public Welfare, and we found money in the state to make up for that. So we did in education. He just said the other day he made a choice, and the choice was that he was not going to fund education in the same way he did. He wasn't going to find that money. If I'm running a business, or if I'm running the state, and sales tax receipts are down dramatically, does that give me the ability to say, I didn't cut? Maybe I cut for a reason, but I'm responsible for making those decisions. I'm responsible for setting the priorities that says that education is down below something else. And in a $29 billion general fund budget, if I'm going to move things around, I'm responsible. And I ought to be held accountable for those things. I don't care where the money came from.
Okay, but he has actually increased spending for public education every year he's been in office. So he's moved it around within education. So maybe your argument there is you don't like where he's moved it around within education. But he's actually increased spending in education every year he's been in office.
I guess
According to the Department of Education, not according to him or his
Yeah.
website. That's according to the Department of Education.
Is the issue that we have fewer teachers in the classroom at this point?
where did that come from? So,
Because we're adding back in the pension
I
money.
mean,
When you add in the pension money, and it's part, if you go to my local school district,
mhm.
and they say, I've got a $120 million budget. Well, everybody knows 80% of that is for salaries and benefits. And that is a big chunk of how we fund public education is through salaries and benefits.
But that's education. It's a service industry. That same thing is true of medicine. My biggest expense in my business is salaries and benefits.
So it's, that's where I was going with that. So it's part of the pie.
Yeah.
I think that the discussion here is has he moved money around within education? It's not that he's cutting money to education. He's
But-
cutting the
but
money
no.
going directly to the classroom.
He did that. But he also cut money. $1 billion was cut in his first year. You were starting out by saying the justification for that was that he didn't have the money coming in from the stimulus money. Okay. But you can't say that the money wasn't cut. It was. You have 27,000 educators that have lost their jobs. You have class sizes that have gone, you have property taxes that have gone through the roof. I mean, we all see the effects of that. So it's somewhat disingenuous to say he didn't cut the money. Maybe he can say it wasn't my fault. Maybe he can point to those bad people in Washington. But under his watch, funding for education was cut. And the result was that we have all these teachers that have lost their jobs, furloughed teachers at Northeastern High School, and most of the school districts in Pennsylvania. That happened. That's a reality of what happened. I'm not sure why we get into these semantic arguments about whether he did or didn't cut funding for education. It's not a priority for him.
All right, let's change the subject for a second.
But just real quick,
Yeah.
just you mentioned those funding sources, and I guess why are those funding sources, when you're talking about cutting education, why is that more important to put in ads than pensions? Because those don't include, why those 3 or 4 funding sources? Why are they, I mean, why are
Well,
they more important?
I'm sorry. if you look at the first year, even I think in your calculations, I sort of did in my head, there was a cut, even if you factor pensions into that. And your point was that that's because the stimulus money was cut. So, okay, but he cut funding in funding was cut. Teachers were laid off. Class sizes were increased. That was a decision he made. It was a choice. He says it was a choice he made. And I'm arguing that that choice was a wrong choice for a healthy economy, for a healthy Commonwealth. And that as governor, it was his responsibility, just like it's the responsibility of anybody who's the CEO of any organization, to make choices. Now you can go and lament the fact that you have been forced to make those choices, that the economy has tanked and you're going to have to make cuts. But you can't step back and weasel out of the responsibility for having made those cuts. You did. You're the one that made those choices. That's where I'm going to cut. I'm not going to cut over here. And that's what he did. And that's all I'm saying. And I think that's the argument.
Okay. Let's jump into some red meat social issues.
If you had
Red meat.
been in that position, would you have cut then social services or the prison system funding?
I looked at other areas. Again, there was I don't know what the overall general fund budget was in that first year that he was budgeting for, but it was big enough that I think you shift priorities, as he did, to say that in terms of social services and corrections, I'm going to continue to fund that. I would look for areas to cut. I would have looked at a 5% severance tax immediately. That would have been a good source of new revenue. I would have looked at a more realistic, I think, charter school reimbursement formula that looks at marginal rather than average cost funding. I would have expanded Medicaid as soon as that came in, and that came in, I guess, a year or so after his first year in office. But I would have looked for ways to expand that, and I would have done what I talked to Scott about in terms of actually increasing economic activity so that our economy started to grow. We're not doing that right now, and those are the things I would have done as a start. And then I would have looked at where those funds are going, and I would have tried to find programs that we could make some savings. We spend 3 or 4 times as much in terms of pension fund management fees as, say, California does, and our pension funds are smaller than California's. I think there are areas that we could look at that go beyond just simply the two that you mentioned, to say in that general fund budget we could find ways to save. It's a matter of establishing priorities. If you think education's important, that's not going to be the first thing I cut. It's going to be the last thing that I cut. And I'm going to look for ways to make sure that we keep that funded as well as we can, for whatever reason, through whatever means, to see that we're following through on what in Pennsylvania is a constitutional mandate to provide thorough and efficient education.
Okay, so.
Red meat.
Yeah, I got a letter to the editor this week that cited an action of PA PAC mailing that said you support use of tax money for sex change operations for state employees. Is that an accurate assertion of your position? And I know you've been sort of supportive of LGBT issues, and I'm just wondering if you could talk generally about your thoughts on those kinds of issues like hate crimes. Should the State Human Relations Commission enforce housing and employment discrimination like York City's Human Relations Commission does?
So which one do you want me to answer first?
Start with the sex change operations.
Yeah, I think
Is that accurate?
we are. Yeah, it is. We are looking at in Pennsylvania, I think, a greater sensitivity to LGBT issues, and we're trying to create. That's part of my level playing field. Pennsylvania has to be a state that is open and welcoming, and the things that I think we look at in terms of gender, in terms of race, I think we're now extending to areas of sexual orientation. And the transgender issue is now one that is new. We're getting a better understanding of it. But my own opinion is that we ought to treat that as we do other civil rights issues. And so, yes, I do believe that we ought to have that as insurance, and I believe we ought to have a non-discrimination rule. Right now in Pennsylvania, you can be dismissed for being gay. I don't think that's right. The federal courts have eliminated the Defense of Marriage Act but we still do have the ability in Pennsylvania to discriminate in terms of housing and employment, and I think that's wrong.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about child abuse. Obviously, it's tragically been a recurring theme in recent years with the Sandusky case locally in New York. We've had the Isabel Baez case. I got a piece today by the Center for Children's Justice in Pennsylvania claiming that neither candidate has really adequately addressed the issues of child abuse. And the question that they want to ask is, what's your action plan to reduce child abuse fatalities and injuries, and would you audit the child abuse hotline to make sure that it's properly staffed, and possibly appoint a child abuse ombudsman in the state? What do you think of those issues?
I don't know about the ombudsman, but it is something that I think we ought to take seriously, and child abuse is something that you know, is serious. We have to make sure that our children are secure in their lives and that they feel safe. Otherwise, we're not going to have good citizens, we're not going to have good employees, and we're going to pay for that. So we need to do what's required, and the state ought to play its role in making sure that we are, as a society, doing everything we can to prevent child abuse.
Do you think
What
that...
about reproductive rights? Mr. Wolf, what's your stand on that and your take on the governor's support of ultrasound imaging before abortion?
Yeah, I don't understand his position at all. I am in strong support of a woman's right to make her own decisions regarding her own health, and that includes reproductive health.
Okay. Just one question. I have one more question. I was hoping that we might be able to get some questions from
I
the
talk too
readers.
much, don't I?
No, it's okay. It's great. So much of your plans sort of hinge on the severance tax, the natural gas severance tax. You know, people can talk about how much it's going to bring in and so forth, or whether it's a good idea. But the thing that I hear in letters to the editor from regular readers is that, this stuff just gets passed along to consumers. Can you explain to us how a severance tax doesn't end up increasing our electricity bills or our heating bills?
Yeah, the severance tax is something we already pay in Pennsylvania. When Alaska, let me just give you an example from Alaska's case. When they have a severance tax on the petroleum that comes out of the North Slope, that is folded into the cost of the barrel of oil and becomes a cost of good for, say, ExxonMobil, goes to the refinery, still embedded in that cost of goods. It's refined into gasoline, and then it's distributed to all the states wherever they sell their gasoline, so that when you buy gasoline where the origin is in Texas or Alaska or any place that has a severance tax, embedded in the price of that gasoline is that severance tax. So we're now paying all the taxes here in Pennsylvania. Whenever we fill up with gasoline, you're paying the severance taxes from Alaska, Texas, and Louisiana, and every place else with a severance tax. So let me just make it, everybody here get a thank you note from the taxpayers of Texas and Louisiana? Of course not. We're the only state in the union with natural gas that doesn't charge a severance tax. So we're paying everybody else's severance tax, but no one else is paying ours. If you impose a 5% severance tax, it is going to be embedded in the cost of goods, and it will reduce or increase the margin that the driller and the refiner ultimately pays. And some of that, if the tax is too high, will be passed on to the consumer. 5%, given the differentials in this is my business background talking, but given the differentials in distribution, sources of much of the gas now in Dakotas and Oklahoma, they have to ship that or pipe it a long way across the country. Pennsylvania's right at the market. The gas is here. The market is here. And some of that gas will be used in Pennsylvania, but it'll be at market, and the people paying the price will probably be the gas company. But the people paying, for the most part, paying that tax, embedded in that cost, will be people outside of Pennsylvania. So like us right now, paying the taxes from Alaska and Texas and Louisiana, other people in New England, New York, New Jersey, Delaware will be paying the tax, that severance tax. It's a tax that really is exportable. And so in that way, it is embedded in the cost of goods, but not necessarily, again, this is deep in the weeds in business, the cost of goods not necessarily in the price, which is going to be set by market. So the margin for the business will be thinner or greater. Right now it's greater because there isn't a severance tax, but the market price will be the market price. And that's the way it's going to be unless the severance tax is some outrageously high tax. That's not what I'm proposing. I want a tax that is going to be helpful to Pennsylvanians, but something that also makes Pennsylvania a partner with this gas industry, that we can do this right, and it's a game changer for our economy.
Mr. Wolf, the governor says that the oil industry, why should they be taxed for being successful? Plus, the difference between Pennsylvania and other oil-producing states is the corporate business tax and the 1.34% surcharge that these companies pay. What is your response to that?
My response is, as I said earlier, I want to cut the corporate net income tax. I think you are right that the corporate net income tax is too high. But a severance tax at 5%, given a reasonable corporate net income tax, is, and 5%, let's say, compares to 7.5%, I think, in Texas, I think is reasonable. It allows us to go to the gas industry and say, listen, we're a partner with you in this. You want skills that are relevant to your industry. You need schools that are turning out, and community colleges and universities that are turning out the skills that are going to help you make this industry work for you and for Pennsylvania. We need your help in helping to fund those things. And so a 5% severance tax is not only not going to deter the interest in our gas fields, which after all are right here and right at the market, but I think will actually help the Commonwealth provide the public goods, many of the public goods, that will make that gas industry successful.
Okay.
Mr. Wolf, Phil Herron from the Delco Times. Question for you. One of the criticisms of the governor has been his inability, even with Republican control of both the Senate and the House, to get crucial parts of his agenda passed into law. Should you be elected, what possible hope should we have for a Democratic governor having much more success with what is very likely going to continue to be a Republican-controlled Senate and House?
That's a great question. Let me just start off by saying I won't do any worse than this governor has done. And I think the thing that I bring to this job is experience in actually getting things done. I have done this, and I don't want to make fatuous comparisons between my business or my background and the needs of the Commonwealth. But I've never done anything in my life or occupied any position of responsibility where I've just wanted to keep a seat warm. I've always wanted to do something, and I've typically been successful because I have learned the skills of getting people to work with me, and I've worked with them. And I think that's what we don't have in Harrisburg right now, leadership. And so whether it's a Republican or a Democratic House or Senate, whoever the governor is going to have to exercise some leadership. I keep saying when I was at Revenue, the Secretary of Revenue, I was struck not by how different people in Harrisburg are, but how similar they are. And that the people there, they have different titles, but they respond to the same things that people in other settings respond to. Persuasive argument, compelling vision, a willingness to listen, to work together, to actually cooperate. You can't sit behind a desk and hope to push buttons and say, I'm going to get things done. That doesn't work. It doesn't work in Harrisburg. It doesn't work at the Wolf Organization. I bet it doesn't work here at the York Daily Record. We have got to have leadership. And what I propose to bring to Harrisburg, which is going to be different from the past 4 years or 3.5 years, is that leadership, is a sense that Pennsylvania can do better, that there are specific things we can invest in, that Pennsylvania can move in a much better direction. And we can get things done regardless of who's in charge, regardless of what the makeup of the legislature is. And let me just say one other thing. I think it was Rahm Emanuel who said that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. I think there's a crisis atmosphere in Harrisburg. I think people on both sides of the aisle, in both houses, and in the bureaucracy are looking at the situation in Pennsylvania saying things aren't good. And it's not just the hollowed out schools, but the economic activity has not been good. We've gone, what with September first came out, we lost over 9,000 people in the workplace in September. We were 47th, I think, in job growth. If you look, Bureau of Labor Statistics figure from 2011 to August, we're now 50th. This isn't good. And the downgradings that we've gotten from Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch are outside evidence, outside opinions on the way the Commonwealth is working. We had to take basically a payday loan out a few weeks ago to keep the lights on, not to buy a bridge, not to pay for a school building, but actually just to pay for ordinary expenses, 2.5 months into the new fiscal year. The hole is pretty deep, and I think people in Harrisburg are alive to that. There's talk right now about a severance tax support coming out of the Republican side of the aisle. So I understand that I am a Democrat. I understand that I am running for a position as governor, not dictator of Pennsylvania, and that I'm going to be working with people to get things done, as I have in the rest of my life and everything else I've done. And I can't guarantee, therefore, that I'm going to be successful, but I'm going to work hard to be successful, and I'm going to do things better and differently than this governor has done to try to bring people together to make things happen for Pennsylvania.
Do we have time for an audience question? Okay, yeah.
One of my concerns in Pennsylvania is just the size of the legislature in Pennsylvania. Just did a little research. I think Pennsylvania is one of the 3 largest.
I think second.
Second, okay. And I just look back and maybe at the time of the establishment of the state, it made sense to have someone on virtually every neighborhood and every street corner. But as technologies come about, we have instant telecommunication. You can talk to a large group of people instantaneously. Technology's improved. Just want to know what your opinion is on cutting back on the legislation, or
Yeah.
being like a state like Texas where part-time legislation can do this.
I have a problem with any proposal that seeks to de-democratize our system. And I think when you talk about reducing the size of the group of people who are elected, I have a concern for that. By the way, you know who number 1 is? Legislatures?
California?
New Hampshire. New Hampshire.
But they're all volunteers, right?
I think they gave $50. It's almost volunteers. So the size, I don't think really matters. What matters is, do you want to make it more democratic? You want to make it more accountable? There are things we can do to reform that. For example, I'm concerned about gerrymandering. We have basically a one-party state in Pennsylvania. Let's deal with that. If we reduce the size of elected members of the House and Senate, you and I would have, they'd have less accountability. We'd have probably more staffers, people who are appointed by who knows whom, and do what they do, and have long-term careers, and the people who are actually accountable to us. If we just reduce the size of the legislature, that accountability is reduced. So I'm a Democrat with a big D, but I'm also a Democrat with a small d. And like you, I want to make our system more responsive, more accountable, and more worthy of trust of the citizens. And my own bias is that we do that. We have to do some things to make it more responsive. But cutting the number of elected officials is not it.
Things like term limits, though?
Term limits is another one of those that I don't think is very democratic. We have the ability to determine. Now, okay, I'm getting geeky here on you. My PhD is in political science. In the 19th century, there were actually rotation of office norms. Voters, if you statistically looked at, and there are some really interesting articles written on this, you looked at, all else being equal, the likelihood of someone being reelected diminished with every increased term. So voters actually have that ability. Why would we want to take that ability away from us? We do that in some, like the governor's, is term limited to 2 terms. But if you look at the number of states in the country, California, for example, has a term limits in their legislature. How's that worked out?
I love California.
Okay, but it hasn't. I don't think it's necessarily increased the democracy quotient. I
just think you can do more with less in today's world. Technology, the infrastructure.
Yeah. So you're talking about making our system more responsive, and I absolutely agree with that. And I've talked about the need to make sure that in this campaign, I've talked about democracy. It's not just about getting things done. It's not just about the transactions of what policies I'm for. I'm also running to be a steward of a grand democratic tradition that was started right here in this state. And to do that, we need to look at ways to make ourselves more responsive. And I'm just arguing that when it comes to things like term limits and the size of the legislature, I think there are other things that we can do to make this system more responsive and more democratic And those, I think we have to be careful. These are great talking points. We're looking for sort of magic potions here, but the task of actually acting as citizens to make our system more responsive is not going to be the matter of flicking a switch. We've got
What are
to.
those things? What changes the
Jerry
legislature
Man-
from basically being self-interested and really focusing on re-election?
I think, personally, I think gerrymandering is a huge thing. I think we could talk about, other things like, Texas, you mentioned, meets every other year. They do 2-year budgets and things like that. New Hampshire pays their legislators, they actually have 3 times as many, I think, as we do. They pay them $50 a session. There are other things that we could do. I would just look at those things and say, the objective here, which you rightly point out, is to make sure our system is more responsive, that it means more, it's more relevant to our lives. And we need to do that. Let me just give you one example of the problem that is, and this isn't going to be fixed by reducing or increasing the size of the legislature. I won the primary. I won every county in Pennsylvania. I won with a 40% margin of victory. The turnout of eligible voters was less than 20. Turnout percentage of registered voters was in the 20s, but eligible voters, those 18 years old and older, was less than 20. The same time we were going to the polls here in Pennsylvania in the Democratic primary, India was voting. India has been a democracy since the late 1940s. They had over 60% turnout. What that said, people had to walk miles, dirt roads, to get to the polling station. What that says is, in India, their democracy is more relevant to the day-to-day lives of their citizens than it is here in Pennsylvania. That's a problem. And your concern is really, really important. And we need to look at that, to say, this is not just about me getting elected. It's not just about us getting policies that might make Pennsylvania better. It's about making our democracy stronger. And right now, we're in trouble. 18% turnout, even if it's in a primary election, is awful. It's a bad reflection on our democracy, and we need to do a better job.
Thank you. Before we get in trouble here.
I talked to, this is my academic background. I'm sorry. Thank you
Thank you
everybody for being here. It's really nice to have you. Thank you very much.